Alaikum wa rahmatullah, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on this auspicious night. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your amal tonight and give you the best of what is good for you in this world and the hereafter, inshallah. For those of you who were here last year, the Suhoor chat needs no introduction. I'm once again extremely honored to be joined by two illustrious scholars who are inshallah going to talk to us tonight or this morning, however you want to say it, about the importance of choosing role models and who we should emulate in our lives as we embark on this journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So first, we're inshallah going to begin with Shaykh Reza Himari, who, alhamdulillah, needs no introduction. And yeah, so inshallah, Shaykh Reza, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours, inshallah.
Thank you so much. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين إنه خير ناصر ومعين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Can you hear me okay? Is the
Yes, we can hear
sound
you.
coming across?
Yeah.
All right, great. So considering that it is the 23rd of the month of Ramadan, Laylatul Qadr, there is a dua, this dua that we recite for our final Imam. It has been recommended for this night. Just whenever you have the ability to, in your prayer, in qunut, in sujood, in ruku, wherever and whatever time. So it's recommended to recite that dua, in particular in this night. So maybe we can begin with that dua, inshallah. Recite it together. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم كل وليك الحجة بن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Okay, so it's really glad to be here with all of you, and inshallah we can spend a few moments here talking about figuring out what are, first of all, role models, why we need role models, and then who we can choose as our role models. And I'd actually set this up partially as a discussion, so inshallah we can maybe have a little bit of a back and forth here. So first, I'd like to think about, can you all see the presentation here?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first, I'd like to, yeah, I'm a novice at PowerPoint presentation, so it seems like it didn't quite work out here. But anyway, before we do that, so wanted to first think about what exactly is a role model. What do we learn from, or why do we need role models? What's the function of a role model? I see a few familiar names and faces here, but anybody want to take that up here? What is the function of a role model?
Someone who you model yourself after so you can behave like them.
Okay, so someone you model your behavior after them, someone you maybe imitate or you emulate in terms of your behavior. Okay, what else?
I think it could also be someone whose life serves as like a blueprint for your own in other aspects as well, right? Not necessarily the day-to-day behavior, but like the overarching themes of their life.
Okay, good. Asant. Okay. And anything else? All right, good. So we have particular actions that we, if you know, a role model functions as giving us a blueprint for particular actions in terms of, say, for example, you know, how we do certain things, uh, and then also how we live our lives. So that larger blueprint. Okay, good. I think to expand on that, we can actually also think of role models so in 3 different levels. Sorry, just give me 1 minute here. I'm trying to figure out how we can go through the slide. Okay, so for one, if we think about a role model as almost like a teacher, we can say, for example, learn certain principles through their words, right? We listen to them. We try to emulate some of the practices or the teachings that they might express. And then a role model in terms of presenting certain actions, right? They're not just saying certain teachings, not just saying certain words to us, and just in terms of larger principles, but they're enacting those principles. They're kind of giving life and to those teachings, to those general principles. They're presenting them in very particular ways. And then a little bit expanded on what you had mentioned. They don't just present us with certain life examples, right, for a larger blueprint. But one of the most important things that a role model can do for us is to actually identify our potential. They can broaden our horizon, right? If, for example, my role model is in sports, right? There's, you know, it's the it's the age of superstars, right? Whether it's in basketball and soccer or what have you. What those people do, if say you know, we choose a role model in soccer, is they show us what potentially a person could do in terms of his soccer skills, right? How much he can advance in those skills. And so what role models do is what one of the main things, I think one of the most important things that role models do is that they broaden our horizons. And they identify those goals or those potentials that we might have within us and that we can actualize. Okay. And so, as you mentioned, there are certain dictionary definitions for role models. A person whose behavior, example, or success is or can be emulated by others, especially by younger people. This is one definition that's given. And I think, you know, this younger people, that part is particularly because it presents that potential, right? We generally think of younger people as having certain potentials that have to be actualized, that have to be realized, and so that has that component as well. Okay. All right. So now let's think about we've thought about what a role model is. Now let's think about well, do we need role models, right? We hear about this again. I'm sorry, the PowerPoint presentation that I was trying to do some effect, but it didn't work out. Anyway, nowadays we talk a lot about being yourself, right? You just have to be yourself. You know, be you. I think is another way of saying this. Like, you know, love yourself, be true to yourself. All of these kind of catchwords that we have. Let's think about maybe take a moment here and think about what does that exactly mean? I don't really know what that means myself. So if somebody can explain that to me, what does it mean to be yourself? Maybe someone you haven't heard from yet. I'm sure you all have heard this before, right?
maybe to do whatever, maybe like whatever you feel is right based off of what you want to do.
Okay, what you feel is right, right? But it's not just saying do what you want, but it's something a little bit deeper, right? It's saying be yourself. It's like not. I mean, there's one level which is in terms of your actions, but what else?
It's saying to find someone to model yourself after, and I guess follow them as if they were Allah, but have more love for Allah. Kind of like use them to facilitate your connection with Allah.
Okay. Yeah, again, the presentation was supposed to hide the verse, but regardless. So yeah, I think, I mean, it's obviously a vague statement and maybe even meaningless, but I think some people take it to be, we all have some innate desires, or we have some certain things within us, whether they're feelings, whether they're certain emotions, whether there are certain thoughts, and we have to just kind of express those, right? We have to express who we are. And one big component of that is don't express who you think other people want you to be, right? That's kind of this, I think this one way of understanding this vague notion of kind of this vague mantra of be yourself. So don't care about what other people want you to do or who other people want you to be. You have to kind of be yourself. And so you have to go, there's this sense of a process of self-discovery you might hear about sometimes. And say, for example, what is my identity, right? Who am I as a person, right? And all of these kinds of these ideas. Now, there is some truth to that, right? On some level, we should not really care. In the end of the day, we should not really mold ourselves based on just what other people think of us, right? On some level, it's true that we should have some principles that we're emulating our lives based on, that we're leading our lives based on, right? But then when we think about who we are, well, we can think about who we are in terms of biological beings, right? We are human beings. We are comprised of a body. We can think of ourselves as having feelings, right? So we can be ourselves in terms of certain beings that have feelings. We can think of ourselves in terms of intellectual beings, right? So I have certain intellectual interests. I don't have other intellectual interests. And then one of the ways that one of the ways that the Quran talks about is being spiritual beings, right? Thinking of ourselves as having a particular soul and having a soul that is connected to God. And so this connection between who we are as human beings and God, that is really how we should define ourselves. That's how the Quran defines us as human beings, right? And so one of the main things that the Quran tells us is that what we need role models for is because if we define ourselves in terms of spiritual beings, we can either be connected to God as the source of our creation, or we can connect ourselves to other things, right? So there's no real alternative to having a role model. Our society might say, don't have any role models, just be yourself. But on the other hand, we have the Quran say that there's actually no other alternative. You either have a role model which is bringing you closer to God, or you have other role models which are taking you away. And I think that's an important point. When we say that this is an individualistic society, right? When we say that this society doesn't really see a need for role models, it's not that the society doesn't impose on us certain morals or certain values, right? I mean, the fact that we are told that we have to be individuals, we have to express our feelings, our wants, our desires, that is our society telling us what to do, right? And so if you look at this ayah of the Quran is saying you either you have to have a role model in the end of the day. There's no real alternative. Either your role model is going to bring you closer to God or it's going to take you away. Right? So this ayah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ومن الناس من يتخذ من دون الله أندادا يحبونهم كحب الله والذين آمنوا أشد حبا لله. Among the people are those who set up compeers, set up partners unto God, besides God, loving them as if they were loving Allah, but the faithful have a more ardent love for Allah. So there is no other alternative. We need role models, and we need to be very conscious about the role models we choose, right? As human beings, we're created in a way to imitate and to emulate others. Either we can see ourselves as, we can choose our role models as bringing us closer to the source of our very existence, or if we choose anything else, that's going to take us away from that source, right? And one important point is that the ayah says, but the faithful have a more ardent love for Allah. And that is because if we recognize who we are, and that is we are spiritual beings, we are souls, ultimately, then if we recognize that reality of who we are, then if we want to increase the potential for that soul, we want to expand the horizons for what we see as our souls, then we have to go to Allah, who is the source and the origin and the final end of those souls. Okay, so that was to talk about the need for choosing role models very consciously, because otherwise, if we don't choose them consciously, then we will automatically set up other role models for ourselves who are taking us away from that, who we truly are. Okay. And this ayah takes that point further, right? When we think about who our role models are, we have to think about our role models in terms of the very purpose of our creation and in terms of the very potential that our creation has, that our beings have, right? So if you're thinking about who we are, then we have to think of ourselves as one of the either the greatest or one of the greatest creations of God. Now there's a debate among scholars, but God has created us as having an almost unlimited potential, right? In terms of our spiritual growth. In terms of our physical growth, in terms of our material growth, we can all experience that and we can sense that very readily in our society, in our time. But in terms of our spiritual growth, we see that the Quran attests to this. God says, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ وَحَمَلْنَاهُمْ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ وَرَزَقْنَاهُم مِّنَ الطَّيِّبَاتِ وَفَضَّلْنَاهُمْ عَلَى كَثِيرٍ مِّمَّنْ خَلَقْنَا تَفْضِيلًا. That final phrase that I want to focus on, and we preferred them with a complete preference over many of those we have created. So some Mufassirun understand this over many of those as being over all of those other things that God has created. Right? So human beings have this expansive spiritual potential, such that in another ayah of the Quran, we're called Khalifa of God. right? And that's a really big burden. It's like we are the representative of God on his earth. Right. Any thoughts on this? Any questions before we move on? Okay. All right. Now that's all just background, and we're trying to figure out whether we need role models or not, and what the criteria for our role models should be, right? Now, when we think about, so once we've figured out that we need role models, once we've also figured out what the criteria for our role models should be, now we think about who should we choose as role models, right? Who is going to allow us to realize that ultimate spiritual potential that we have. This hadith of Imam Sadiq, the Imam says, this is just further clarifying this idea of the importance of actually choosing a role model consciously. The Imam says there is no safer path to tread by wise believers than emulation. It is the clearest method and leads to the best goal. God says to his greatest creation, meaning the Prophet, they are the ones whom Allah has guided, so follow their guidance. And if there were a sturdier path for God's religion than emulation, he would have called his prophets and awliya towards it. So what this is saying is that God himself is even saying to the creation and to the best of his creation that you should also emulate, that you should follow, that you should set up your own role models, right? And so that means that figuring out who our role models are is even more important, right? Okay. So now let's think about the Prophet. So of course, you know, the Prophet as a role model is pretty obvious for, again, for all of you who are here. It may be obvious, but in this ayah of the Quran, Surah Al-Ahzab, ayah number 21, exemplifies this point, right? That if we're thinking about creating role models for ourselves in terms of fulfilling that ultimate spiritual potential that we have, then of course the Prophet who has fulfilled that spiritual potential, that will be the first role model that we look towards, right? And the Quran says this, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ, right? And then it says the reason for why he's a good exemplar. لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُ اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرَ وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا. So how is the Prophet a role model? He is a role model for all of those who look forward, who have hope in Allah in the day of judgment, and who remember God a lot, right? So the ayah doesn't just say he's a role model and that's it, right? It gives very specific examples of how the Prophet is our role model. So when we look at the Prophet's life, the highest level of kind of emulation and following that we can do of the Prophet is by looking at the way that he looks forward and he has hope in God, right? And how he remembers God. Okay. Now, one of the things that we think about, I mean, and this is as well for not just the Prophet, but as well applies to the Imams, right? Is when we think about the Prophet as a role model. Now that's easy to say, right? If we think about, okay, the Prophet is the greatest of God's creation, you know, is the source of, or the conduit, the messenger for God. He's brought God's religion to us. All of that's great. He's of course also a perfect creation, right? So he's a perfect human being. Now let's think about, well, if we're trying to choose a role model as expanding our horizons, but also as somebody that we can imitate. Can we really imitate someone who's perfect? Is that possible, you guys think? Is it possible for us to imitate someone who's perfect?
I don't think it's possible to emulate them perfectly, but if you have a higher example, I think you can reach a higher standard as well. So if you don't reach like perfection, you can reach at least closer to perfection than following not a perfect example.
Okay, good. So, sorry, can you still see the PowerPoint presentation, or has the screen switched?
Yeah.
It's showing the first screen, the role models for Muslims, the title screen.
Oh, has it been showing that the whole time, or has it been? This is
Now it's showing the imams as role models.
I see. Okay. All right. I still can't figure this out. All right. Anyway, so thinking about the imams, or trying to use the imams as our role model, we're saying that it can give us better results basically than if we didn't, right? Than if we followed somebody who's maybe less perfect. Was that the idea? Brother, who would answer?
Yeah,
Okay.
that was kind of the idea.
Okay. Anybody else?
I agree with that point. Because if you follow someone who is flawed, or if someone who's flawed is your role model, then you might pick up on their flaws.
Okay, good. So if we choose a perfect role model, then again, it gives us a wider, say, for example, potential for what we could have otherwise done, right? For example, if we choose an imperfect role model, then it makes it almost seem like it's okay. This person has done all of these things. Maybe it's okay for me to as well maybe have these flaws, right? And so in those particular parts of our life, then we won't grow. We won't really reach a higher potential than that person has. Okay, so whatever limits that person has, then they would also be our limits. Okay. All right. Well, so that's good. That's one good way of thinking about how to bridge that gap between, say, a perfect role model and who we are as imperfect human beings. Another way of thinking about it is by seeing the status of an imam or the status of a prophet as having different levels. In other words, there are different functions that an imam fulfills, right? There are certain functions that an imam fulfills that are just given by God. There's, the imam is the representative of God on this earth. He does not ever make any mistakes. He knows God's religion to its fullest extent. And so that is something that we really don't have any access to. And this is something that we're also told by the Ahlul Bayt themselves. Another function of the Imam, or another level of the Imam's personality, of the Imam's being, is something where, as you all mentioned, in terms of a perfect human being, right? And there's this part of the Imam is also a little bit out of our grasp. It's out of our reach. So, for example, there's a hadith from Imam Ali where the Imam says, basically that it's hard for you, it's impossible for you basically for you to be able to emulate me in the entirety, right? And all of my in all of the different aspects of my being, right? So in this hadith, it's actually it's also in Nahj al-Balagha. Imam Ali says, for every follower, there's an imam whom he follows, and from whose illuminating knowledge the follower attempts to benefit. Indeed, your imam suffices himself from this world, meaning himself, he's talking about himself, with his 2 worn-out clothes and in food with just these 2 morsels. So the imam, we know, really kind of sufficed himself. He didn't really eat much more than just a few, just a little bit of food, right? But you don't have the ability to sustain that. So one aspect, one dimension of Imam Ali's characteristic, not just in terms of that responsibility that he has in terms of the representative of God, but as well just the amount of potential that the Imam has is greater than what we have, right? When what the Imam responds is, even though you don't have this ability to emulate me in all of my, fully, aid me through your piety and effort, your decency and your ability to attain the right path. So we can emulate the Imam by at least coming somewhat close to, even though we can never get to that level of perfection that they have, but trying, right? Strident effort. Figuring out what are the virtues that the Imam has outlined and beginning our path on that virtue. Okay? But that's not the only dimension that the Imam has, right? Another dimension that the Imam has is certain virtues and certain actions that we can also emulate, right? So for example, if we think about very specific examples, right? Specific aspects of our Prophet's lives. When we think about, for example, who other than the Prophet we could emulate, right? There's a hadith of, actually, before we get to this one, yeah. There's an ayah of the Quran, Surah Al-Mumtahana, where the Prophet, the Quran also talks about this idea of uswa hasana, this good exemplar, okay? And so this is an ayah about Prophet Ibrahim, where he says, where the ayah says, قد كانت لكم أسوة حسنة في إبراهيم والذين معه إذ قالوا لقومهم إنا براء منكم ومما تعبدون من دون الله. Okay, so we're thinking about what Prophet Ibrahim did in terms of his people when they rejected God, when they rejected the message of Prophet Ibrahim and they continued to worship those idols other than God. Okay, now this is an example of almost like when we are required to separate ourselves from certain practices that go against our religion. Okay, and this is something that we can emulate. This is an aspect of Prophet Ibrahim's character that we could potentially emulate, right? Now, what this does is it gives us an insight into what it means to have principles and to act and live by those principles. This is one aspect of Prophet Ibrahim's life that we can choose him, or we can identify him as a role model. When we are faced with, say, a situation where we have to either choose between a religion and, say, for example, having certain acquaintances, having certain kind of interactions, then we will live based on our principles, right? We won't compromise on those principles. At the same time, when we look at the Prophet, our own Prophet's life, and we look at the way that he interacted with his community members, we see that we can choose, we can see another aspect of the way that we can interact with community members, with our friends, and so on. Right? This is another virtue that the Prophet exemplified, and that we can emulate the Prophet. So this is these stories of our Prophet. I think this is one of the kind of the beautiful ways that we can really learn about the Prophet and try to emulate him. And so he says, this report says, whenever the Prophet was around other people, he would sit with them and he would engage in whatever they wanted to engage with. So if it were, say, for example, talking about the hereafter, talking about religion, the Prophet would also talk about religion. If they wanted to talk about, say, certain difficulties or certain things about their own lives, then he would talk about their own lives, right? When we were seated with him, if we started talking about the hereafter, he started speaking about it. And if we started talking about this world, he too would start speaking about that. If he spoke about food and drink, he would speak about that too, right? So on the one hand, we have certain cases where we have to, be able to isolate ourselves, where, say, for example, there are certain principles that we have to live by, and we can take that, the model of Prophet Ibrahim, where he stood his ground based on his principles. On the other hand, when it's not a matter of our basic foundational principles, we have another role model in our Prophet, in our own Prophet, where he would engage with people, right? And he would engage with them with, whatever means they wanted to engage, right? Not based on what he wanted. Maybe he didn't want to talk about food and drink, but he would still sit with them because of the very fact that being around other people, like sincerely engaging and talking and communicating with other people, is a virtue in and of itself. And so we can pick up on that virtue that the Prophet exemplified, the Prophet of Islam exemplified, and use that as our role model in the way that we interact with other people. Okay? And so one thing that this brings out is that it brings out that when we look at, say, the different prophets' lives, there's different characteristics that, for example, the Quran presents in terms of one prophet versus another. Okay? Or for example, one imam has expressed more in his life as opposed to another. So for example, when we think about Imam Hussein, we can think about a role model in terms of sacrifice, right? When we think about Imam Hassan, we have a role model in terms of his generosity. And so this gives us a kind of a wider range of kind of a fuller picture of who we can become, right? Our potential, right? So these are all, again, perfect examples, right? Now let's think about imperfect examples. So in our own lives, who are, say, certain people that we can choose as role models? What's the criteria that we would have? Sorry, I've been talking quite a bit here, but anybody have any thoughts? I mean, we can either talk about the criteria or specific individuals that you can choose.
For
so we've talked about the prophets, we've talked about the imams as role models, but those are, say, perfect examples. What about people in that were maybe even closer to you?
Maybe people from the community who know Islam and who are very knowledgeable. So they're not infallible, but they are good examples because they're good people.
So on that point, there's this hadith of our Prophet where he says, in terms of the criteria that we're using, and then as well the people. So on that point of knowledge, the Prophet says, the apostles of Prophet Isa asked him, whose company should we keep? Right? Who should we? It says nojalis, like who should we sit with? Who should we interact with? And he replied, be in the company of the person whose sight reminds you of God, whose speech increases your knowledge, and whose actions make you desire the hereafter. Right? So he gives us like the criteria. Right? So if, again, we're choosing role models based on fulfilling, first of all, based on expanding our horizons, based on fulfilling our spiritual potential, then we would choose people who do these things. Person whose sight reminds us of God, who's just by seeing them, by being around them, that reminds us of God. Whose speech increases your knowledge, their words, and whose actions make you desire the hereafter. Right. So both in terms of words, in terms of actions, and in terms of their presence. Okay. I'm pretty much out of time here. I'll just end there with just maybe a few resources that we can explore ourselves. And so for example, we talked about our perfect role models, thinking about the prophets, right? Looking at reading the prophets' biographies, for example. Our Prophet of Islam, as in particular, there's a really good book, Sunan al-Nabi. It's a book compiled by Allama Tabatabai. It's been translated into English. And in this book, I think it's particularly nice because he's compiled reports where it really kind of gives you a very clear sense of how the Prophet would interact with people. It's like a very sort of flesh and blood type of reports. It explains like very clearly how the Prophet would engage with people. He would talk to people. He would try to find people, say, for example, to eat with, and so on and so forth. All right? And then, of course, our Imam's biographies. And then finally, I think, again, thinking about who amongst who we can find as role models that are close to us, for those who are here, imagine that all of you, or at least most of you, are close to your communities, right? You have people in your lives who are, whether they're elders, your parents, brothers or sisters, or even friends who are part of your community that you can engage with. And I think that's important, not just because of the conscious decisions that we make in terms of who we want to choose as a role model, or say, for example, as a mentor, but also the unconscious sort of way that we follow other people, right? A lot of times we don't really think about the way we emulate other people, the way they talk, the way they dress, the way they interact with others. And that's really important, right? Role models are not just certain, names that we've kind of checked off and that we've chosen to follow, but also a lot of times we emulate the people that we're around. And so being around community members, people who are more pious than us, are more knowledgeable than us, whether they're scholars, pious individuals in our communities, even though they might not, say, for example, for those who are choosing a particular career, even though they might not be in our career, what they show us is how we can lead our lives, because that's really what we ultimately want to know, how we can lead a good life. And that's really the best thing that we can have a role model for. All right. So I'll stop there. I don't know if there can maybe open it up to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sheikhna. That was, insightful for me. But I'm kind of curious as to how all of this, this topic kind of is encompassing of a lot of different things, but the thing that kind of sticks out in my head is like friendships, both general and intimate ones. So how do we go about, in light of everything you just said, how do we go about making sure that the people that we're around on a day-to-day basis, or a weekly basis, monthly basis, whatever it is, as Sayyid Suleiman likes to say, like the family we choose for ourselves, how do we make sure that they are, sort of in line with the role models that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent down to us?
So I've talked quite a bit.
Yeah.
If Sayyid is available, maybe can benefit from.
Sayyidna.
Ahsantum. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
So I hope the topic is not too heavy for, well, as Sister Hidayah said, late night, early morning, however you want to consider it.
Yeah.
It's a very important topic, and I think one of the things that Sheikh Raza mentioned is that, in some definitions, role models are often seen as something for young people, and maybe young people do naturally try to find role models, or maybe they find heroes who kind of function as role models or idols, as people will sometimes call them. But we do need role models as we get older, even if sometimes we get more confident. That confidence is often not really a sign that we know more, or that we are able to make worthwhile decisions about what really matters. We have experience, but sometimes we also have more temptation. So it's really, I think, a useful topic for all ages, and maybe more so as we outgrow our earlier role models. So a lot of you guys who are younger, there's probably gonna come an age, or maybe it's already come, when you used to idealize your parents, and then all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, my parents aren't perfect. My dad's not Superman, my mom's not Supermom or Superwoman. You realize that they're just people. And sometimes we go up and down. And Islam gives us a way to deal with the difficulty of managing expectations that change and that aren't met. And I think that, Sister, this relates to your question, but there's other parts of your question that maybe we can, deal with in conversation.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I find really beautiful is that Islam teaches us, first of all, not to idealize our parents. So Islam, at least the Quran, never talks about obeying your parents. It says, وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. And ihsan is different than obedience. It's a little more difficult in some ways, because, when your mom tells you to clean your room, you can obey her by making a face, stomping off to your room, slamming the door, and cleaning it up. You've obeyed, but it's not kind. So in some ways, ihsan is more difficult, but it's also more liberating, because sometimes your parents may ask you to do something and that's not best for you, or your conscience tells you that you shouldn't do it. Now, if it's haram, of course, the Quran says you don't obey it. But it might not be haram, it might just not be the best decision, because you have certain experience, or you see things in a way that maybe your parents don't see. And in those cases, ihsan doesn't mean you do what your parents say, but it means that you are kind, respectful, and very careful about their feelings when you do what you know is right, or what you know is best, even if it might be different from what they are asking you to do. So ihsan is a separate concept it overlaps with obedience, because sometimes the best way to honor your parents is just to do what they tell you to do, even if it's not what you want to do. Like if my dad tells me, why don't you wear the blue shirt? And I don't want to wear the blue shirt. Well, it's not that big a deal. So if it's something that it might not be what I wanted to do, kindness would be just go and do it. But then if there is a reason why I want to do something different, a valid reason, then I might do what I know is best, but be very kind to my parents. So the very fact that the Quran tells us the focus of our relationship with our parents is ihsan and not ita'ah, kindness and not obedience, it's telling us don't idealize them. And therefore, manage what you do and how you interact, not necessarily how you see them. And some parents are kinder than others. They're maybe more close to their kids. Some are more distant. Some are busier. Everybody's different. The other related part is where the Quran says that think of Ahlul Bayt as your family, more than your own family. So God forbid, even if I have a dysfunctional family, God forbid, the fact that in my mind, the image of a father or a mother or a brother or a sister or a family, a spouse when I'm old enough, is really the model I get from Ahlul Bayt. Lady Khadija, Lady Fatima, Prophet Muhammad, Imam Ali, Abu Talib, Fatima bint Asad, and all of the other members of Ahlul Bayt. That helps me deal with those areas where in my own family, not just my parents, but my brother and sister and all of those relationships that are maybe a little bit less than ideal. And I don't get alienated from my family because I have that model of what an ideal family should look like. And then those parts of my family that are in line with that ideal, I benefit from it. Those parts that are not in line with that ideal, I don't demonize my family. I don't, separate myself from my family, but I kind of fill that gap with Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. And that can help us keep an ideal, but not get disheartened when our lived reality is not that ideal. And it's a difficult thing, especially for Shia Muslims, because we have such high ideals. It's very easy, your alim, your sheikh or your sayyid, except Sheikh Reza, he's pretty close to an ideal. But,
Sayyid Suleiman too.
I wish.
For sure, yeah.
But if you get close to any non-ma'soom, then you're going to find they do some things well and they do some things not so well. And ourselves as well. We don't want to lose hope in ourselves. We don't want to lose hope in our community leaders, our scholars, our parents, our family members. And one of the ways we do that is we see everybody as somewhere in relationship to the true ideal of Ahlul Bayt. And even a person who might have many shortcomings that are visible to me, I try to fit that in the path. And if they have a love for Ahlul Bayt, then we're on the same team, on the same journey. And so I can see the good, benefit from the good, and kind of box out that part which is maybe not so good and fill that gap with Ahlul Bayt. So I don't know if that addresses part of what you were asking about. There's certain parts I think that are a little bit separate and maybe we can.
Yeah, definitely. So, kind of going along with that, at least in sort of the Western world, there's this idea of like, never meet your heroes, right? Because they're not ever going to quite, get to the level that you think they are, right? Because at the end of the day, we're all incredibly flawed human beings on one level or another. So taking a step back and looking at it from the perspective of like the quote unquote sinful heroes, how do we cope with that, right? Because it can be quite debilitating for a lot of people, when, you know, someone that I hold in such high esteem is, they do not meet that, right? And that can be my fault on some level for putting them on that pedestal, but it can also be their fault, you know, for not meeting that ideal. I get in a lot of trouble for saying that our ulama, for instance, should be held to a higher standard than the average person, right? Because, you know, if you know better, you should do better, right? But that doesn't always translate, except for these two. They're always, you know, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. But just in general, you know, there's an idea that like our ulama, muraja, whoever it is, right? They're not perfect. And so when I see them doing something that, you know, even if it's fine for, let's say, someone like me to do, right? The very fact that someone has an imam on their head or anything like that, like, how do I cope with that, would you say?
Sure, I guess I'll start, and then Sheikh Reza, if you'd like to add anything, and anybody else, you know, feel free. I saw, I think Musa had a comment in the chat window, but feel free. I think we can include people to join in, you know, with your voice as well. There's two parts to the question, I think. One part is sometimes when you meet your hero and, you know, that romanticized idea drops, one part is that you're seeing something that maybe you didn't see before. The other part, though, is that you should also question what maybe you need to change about expectations and ideas. So I'll give you one example. Sheikh Bahjat, you've probably all heard of him, you know, the famous Ayatollah Bahjat, famous Arif. And I had the honor of first getting my turban when I went to Iran through him. So the custom in Iran that ulama would place a turban on, you know, a young student's head. Now, sometimes he would be kind of blunt with people. So, you know, somebody comes, and if you've heard stories or maybe experienced it, you know, but people come with this ideal that here is a man of God and somebody, you know, very, very pious and spiritual, and maybe, you know, they brought hopes for prayers and dreams, and they're kind of shaking a little bit because they're nervous that, you know, what's going on. And then they come to him and he might say, you know, this is what you need to do, and I need to move on. Or, you know, he might answer one question and then turn to somebody else. Now, one response is to be, well, I guess there's not, you know, that mystique anymore, or maybe I might judge. But another thing is for me to step back and say, well, maybe the fact that I had idealized and created an image of what this person should be like is because of my own failure to understand what that person is seeing. Now, Sheikh Bahjat is not ma'soom, Sayyid Sistani is not ma'soom, and we can't say that everything they do is right. But at least for me, I should be humble. And that's kind of what Prophet Musa had when he went to meet Khidr alayhi salam. He was ma'soom, but he saw that Khidr alayhi salam did certain things, and those things didn't make sense even to a ma'soom. So you need to have that humility, and Allah wanted to teach Prophet Musa that humility, that even if you're ma'soom, Allah gave you a whole bunch of knowledge, but there's still certain things that you don't know. And when God decrees death for a young child or an old person, is something that even a prophet of God might not know fully. And we might think that, well, this person died before their time. But nobody dies before their time. Allah has everything in an account. So the same token, I need to be kind of humble when I meet somebody of greater knowledge than myself. They're not ma'soom. I can't idealize their behavior, but I should not idealize my own understanding either, and say, maybe it's me that I consider this behavior to be wrong. The other part, though, is that with that humility, the second part of the question is, you will see certain things that don't make sense, and don't have to have an opinion, I would say. a lot of times we kind of we have a habit of saying this is right, this is wrong, I agree with this. In our society, we really don't have enough cases where we say, you know what, I have the right to a vote, but I really don't have the right to an opinion.
Mm.
I'm not talking about a political election, but maybe any issue that we have, where I should just say, hey, look, whatever you think is best. You know more than me. You have more experience than I am. Whether it's an older sibling or friend or guardian or parental figure or scholar, or even if I have a choice and the right to make a choice, I then give that choice to somebody else, not because I want to be lazy, but because I want to learn and gain from their experience. So sometimes we just reserve judgment.
Yeah.
And there will be cases where we see behavior, God forbid if somebody that we had looked up to lies.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that this is not a justifiable situation, then that's part of growing up, to realize that we need a ma'asum, because none of our other role models can take the place of Imam Ali or the Prophet or Lady Fatima or Lady Khadija or Lady Zainab. But for many cases, when I see somebody, do something a little bit off, it's probably more reasonable for me to just reserve judgment and let that gradually be something that I can understand a little bit better.
Okay, Sheikh Reza, thoughts?
I won't take up too much time, but having met some heroes, like Sayyid himself, I will say that honestly, I think this idea of meeting your heroes kind of spoiling that relationship, it seems to I think be a little bit also overblown. I mean, in addition to all of the I think correct approach that Sayyid was mentioning, I think one of the main struggles that we have in this society and just generally is that sometimes it almost seems like we expect that our heroes are going to fall, right? That's almost like the ideal. And that may be a function of various things, religiously, say the biblical heroes were all very flawed. And so we expect any hero that there is to also be flawed. Maybe it has religious sources, maybe it has cultural sources or whatever it might be. But I think once we actually meet certain people who are truly pious, then a lot of that fear, a lot of that expectation also falls off as well. So, in addition, again, to all of what Syed had just mentioned, that adjusting our expectations and being able to meet those people in terms of on their terms and not necessarily on our own terms, and reserving judgment. But I do think that in addition to all of that, there is this expectation that we have in the back of our mind that they are ultimately flawed, and maybe we should also check that part of it. And that may be a function of not having nor not meeting truly virtuous people in our lives. And if we are able to meet more of those people, then maybe we can reconsider that as well.
That's so interesting, because it almost seems to be this balancing act, right? Because on the one hand, you don't want to put anybody, on a super high pedestal where they can't meet it, but at the same time, you, just like Sheikh Reza was saying, you don't want to go into something expecting that a hero is going to be, one way or the other, or they're going to fail. Yes, Musa, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question based off of what Sheikh had said. Is it possible that the idea that we have that, this hero is going to fall, that expectation we have contributes to what we perceive as them falling, like if they're blunt, for example? because we expected them to fall, we'll blow that out of proportion, like they're blunt, so that's their fall essentially, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Is that
Very
perhaps
good
one of the
question.
reasons why it's such a big deal?
Yeah, I mean, potentially. I think again, if we live with people, and I think this is part of the beauty of the Prophet's character, is that when we're able to engage with people on a sort of on a real level, like without having certain expectations, undue expectations, then the longer that we engage with them, a lot of the nuances and a lot of the sort of the subtleties in their own actions become apparent to us. So for example, like, you know, if we just have a one-time interaction with someone, we won't be able to really see, well, how do they deal with their kids, or how do they deal with their spouse, or how do they deal with other community members. We only just get a glimpse, like a snapshot. But if we actually engage with a person more, and that snapshot might be good or bad, right? We wouldn't know. But if we engage with someone more, the more we engage with them, I think the more, again, that opens up our horizons for what are the possibilities for interacting with other people. And yeah, I mean, potentially it could be the way that person interacts may be bad or may be good, and we should be both, again, adjusting our preconceptions, but also being open to that and not blinding ourselves. But I think once we're able to open ourselves, then we can actually engage and learn from them in terms of the creativity that they use, right? So for example, like a lot of times we get into certain habits in terms of the way we interact with our siblings, right? Meeting someone and interacting with a role model on a very regular basis can actually open up those habits and allow us to recreate those habits in better ways. So not having that expectation that they're going to fall, I think would be useful in allowing us to open ourselves and engage with someone more regularly.
Interesting. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, I guess my question would also be this idea of when you're young, and you have certain role models, and the people that you're around maybe might not have those same role models. And so it's like there's a certain pressure to choose the kind of role models that like everyone around you knows or is comfortable with in some way. So it's not cool for my role model to be Imam Ali alayhi salam, for example, right? Everyone else is LeBron James, right? And the things that LeBron James does on or off the court, like can't compare to what Imam Ali alayhi salam does, right? So how do we, especially as young people, right? How do we get to this point where we are comfortable with having Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, or people who are close to them, as our role models, rather than sort of, you know, the influencer going with the flow kind of mentality. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, thoughts?
Go ahead, Sheikh Reza, would you like to address that?
Please go ahead.
I mean, it's an important question because people have role models that kind of, or not role models. I don't know if people would say sports stars are role models, but we have ideals.
Ideals, yeah.
That society gives us, and people look up to celebrities. Sometimes because of their talent, you know, that they're really good at a sport, but sometimes also because, you know, when you're rich and you're powerful, and you might even have somebody who's there to make your image, you know, cover up your shortcomings, then, you know, they might speak out for fashionable topics or even for really good topics. And that kind of contributes to the idealization. So it's an important topic. Sheikh Reza, would you like to begin on how we get to a point where Ahlul Bayt become our role models, and then maybe you can share a few thoughts as well. And
Um,
if you have any thoughts as well, so don't only pose questions, but share your experiences.
Oh, from it, yeah. Okay, maybe after, Sheikhna. Go ahead.
no, I think I've talked enough, but
No.
I'll just to get things started. I mean, so for one, I think being just being aware of, I mean, getting to know them more, and being aware of how in Islamic civilization for more than 1,000 years, people have tried to kind of bring out the all of the different dimensions of Imam Ali, whether it's in terms of sports. So for example, the strength of Imam Ali, right? It's a huge almost it's an exemplar for wrestlers and for bodybuilders, traditional bodybuilders, and so on. I mean, that's one dimension of the Imam that they bring out. Or, for example, in terms of warriors and the courage of the Imam. And this has been going on, and we have literature on this. We have poetry. We have in praise of the Imam, and kind of reconnecting ourselves back to that civilization. And I think connecting back to that civilization gives us both knowledge in terms of the different the expansive personality of for example Imam Ali, but also gives us a confidence, right? That for over 1,000 years, Muslims had such a vast and such a diverse and such a sort of a beautiful civilization that was able to contribute in so many different ways, and just reconnecting to that, I think, could help in one kind of be one step towards rekindling those role models. But yeah, that's just one thought.
Okay. Musa, do you have a thought or a question to share? We'll start with you.
Yeah, I was just gonna, I guess not answer, but try to talk about the question you posed in Sheikh Fadl's speech, or not speech, in his presentation. He was saying how we should surround ourselves with those people who remind of us Allah, and who we can, who are those kinds of friends who remind us of God. And maybe that can be one of the steps we take, to not surround ourselves with people who think of LeBron James as much of as a hero, as a role model, but people who think of Imam Ali as a role model, or Imam Hassan as a role model, for example.
Yeah, I think in my experience, as sort of someone who grew up, I like to say, between the East and the West, and experiencing both of those, for lack of a better word, extremes. It's hard, right? I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it. It's really hard to be in high school and to be like the one person that's like, hey, it's salat time and it's also lunchtime, and I'm going to take 15 minutes to go pray and then come to lunch, for example. And people are like, that's really weird, right? Or to even right now be an adult with, who has a job, and it's like, oh, hi, yeah, I have to go pray. This meeting can wait, and like everything can wait. I'll be back, So it's an extremely, it's kind of an awkward thing. It's much easier, and it was much easier when we were in Iran, because like you don't have to do anything. It's all, salat time is at the same time, and everybody just goes to salat, right? The whole city, the whole country pauses for this. But here, it's much harder to do that, and a lot of times it feels extremely isolating to be the person who is doing that. So yeah, I definitely 100% sympathize and empathize with that, as someone who's experienced it myself. But I can also say that as someone who's kind of, much older than a lot of you guys here, it is not ever worth it to go with the flow of what your friends want to do. As difficult as it sounds to say that, and as uncool as you're going to feel in some of these situations, like every single time that I have made a choice that wasn't something that was like the ideal choice of what like Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam would want me to do, right? And like, just as an example, like not praying awad al-waqt because I have a meeting or something like that. It's so not worth it. And usually the meeting is like nothing, it's one of those like could have been an email kind of meetings. Usually it's never anything important, right? And at the end of the day, something like rizq comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? It doesn't matter that I have a boss or a manager or any of those things. At the end of the day, rizq comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if this person is going to penalize me for being in this situation where I'm like, no, I have to go and talk to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I can talk to you later. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to find a way to supplement that. And I know it sounds very cliche and much easier said than done in a lot of these situations, but I promise you, like the more you do it also, I think the more you become conscious of it in your own life. And also like whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes away from you, he always gives, something back, and usually something better than what you could have expected. So say it.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to say one thing about the last point that you made. What's unique about our Islamic worldview, I think, is that as you move forward in life, your contentment and your tranquility increases. And this is something that, traditional societies, even outside of Islam, were like this. Old men, old women were like the centers of their family, their community. They might be, not as attractive as they were when they were young, and but they have a whole lot more respect. Everyone looks up to them, and that's part of traditional culture. It's a big part of Islamic values as well, and not just your family and your friends, but your own life as well. Hidayah, as you said, that once you do it, then Allah reinforces it, and gradually you see that more and more. So initially it's a little bit of a difficult decision, but gradually it becomes a lot easier. So the orientation of Western society is you're only in high school once, you're only young once, and then when you get old, you want to do plastic surgery, and you want to, when you're 40, you buy a sports car to pretend you're still a teenager, and people are trying to recapture their youth. And getting old scares people. And that's kind of a messed up culture, not to judge it, but it's messed up in the sense that you're all getting old anyway. There's nothing you can do about it. You can, so Islamic culture orients us in the opposite direction. But the investment now, and it's not that you're going to live a bad life, because even when you're young, good family, good habits, you miss out on some superficial pleasures, but you get a lot right away. But more than what you get right now is, when you're young and other people are thinking about just having fun for themselves, if you're thinking about studying, about growing as a person so you can be a good spouse, starting a family, like these kinds of thoughts, then you'll have a whole lot more intimate relations with your family, elders, your own generation, and then younger when you're in your 20s, 40s, 50s. So you build, life gets better day by day, even as you get older, and maybe your physical body, starts to age. That's the goal. And it's something that our Islamic values and culture, it gives us, that is very valuable.
Yeah. I'm also curious about this idea that we are all in some respect, role models, right? For one another. And I've heard this come up, time and time again in my own life, just the idea of like, what if I'm not good enough to be a role model for anybody, really, right? So how do you, how first of all, is that the right mindset to have when talking about these sorts of things? And, if it is, feel free to elaborate. And if it's not, then how do we come out of that, that kind of idea? Because just as a very simple example, I've heard people say like, oh, I am going to stop wearing hijab as an example, because I can never wear it like, say, the Zahra wears it, right? My hijab is never going to be comparable to, say, the Zainab's hijab, for example. So like, why even bother, And there is this thing of, I have my personal thoughts on that. And, inshallah, maybe I'll share it after people more knowledgeable than me sort of share their perspectives. But how do you navigate this idea that I'm not good enough to do this, and so therefore I'm going to do nothing?
Sheikh Rizzo, we haven't heard from you for a while.
Yeah.
Why don't you start?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Okay, so just to start things off then, I think thinking about piety not as a on or off thing, or as an all or nothing thing, but more as a habit, right? So thinking about virtues as habits. What do I mean by habit? So when you're trying to create a habit, a new habit, for example, you want to get up early, you want to start your work, focus as opposed to getting distracted. What you do is you practice, right? You set a goal for yourself, and then you practice, and then maybe once a week or once a month, you might reevaluate. You might assess, well, I've gotten this close to my goal. I had these problems. For example, I have a daughter, young daughter, and we're trying to teach her certain things, right? Teach her how to ride a bike and so on, take off the training wheels. Every day, we might set up a schedule, right? This day she was able to do this. This day she wasn't. And then thinking about virtue in that way, right? That, for example, my hijab, I'm going to try to fix it every single day. I'm going to try to be less self-conscious about it. Or for example, thinking about being kind to my siblings, or being kind to my coworkers, or whatever, the people around me. I'm going to practice this. I'm going to set a goal for myself. I'm going to practice this and work on it until I get good at it. And then thinking about it in those terms, I think, first of all, breaks us out of this habit of thinking, well, it's either I do all of it or not, or none of it. And then secondly, I will realize that at some point I'll get good at it. And then I can also maybe help someone else along that path. And then so that allows me to then not think of myself as someone who has accomplished something, insurmountable. And so therefore I get some sense of sort of hubris about it. But I think about it in terms of, well, I was able to do it, and so maybe I can help someone else along as well. I was able to overcome this flaw. Maybe somebody else can overcome it. And that takes it away from that sense of selfishness, that sense of, well, I'm someone special. It's not someone special. It's the both the effort, the idea that this is a virtue. All of these things are given to us by God. And so divorcing it from myself, that's one part of it. And then that can allow you to also help someone else along the way.
Say it.
Yeah, I think that was very well stated. I think that the key is exactly what Sheikh Reza said, that you don't idealize what God expects from you. God created me as a person with all of these different whisperings and different distractions, and he knows that it's going to be hard. And that's what makes it valuable. for me to gradually perfect my own practice. But I have a responsibility as I'm in each step of that process. And that responsibility is both to look up to those ahead of me and to help those who are, one step behind me, and understand, respecting where we are as the test that God has created us with can help a lot. So you know how a lot of people say that, well, I'm this way, and God didn't make a mistake, and so I should just be this way. Well, that's not true. God didn't make a mistake. The way you are is exactly the way He wanted you to be, and that is your starting point, not your ending point. So He made you that way, and that's not a mistake. But He wants you to use that to reach your potential and be better.
Yeah, I think, the way that I tend to think about this, in particular, like the hijab example, as someone like who obviously wears hijab, and is around, some people who don't, I tend to think of my hijab as the sort of one thing that I do for God, right? And so if I do absolutely nothing else perfectly, which by the way, I'll get to that as well, I do this, right? And maybe it doesn't look exactly the way, say, the Zahra's, hijab looks like, but the very fact that you're striving, I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala records that, and he sees that. And it's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to judge us according to our own capacities, right? Because there are certain potentialities that some of us are never going to be able to meet just based on circumstances, where we were born, how we were born. And so our sort of what we are in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is never going to look the same as a result of all of those things, right? But also, I think more importantly, the larger issue here is the perfectionism, right? And I am someone who struggles with that. Even like just a small example, the flyer for this event, I was like, no, the font is weird and we need to change this. And, the name of the scholar needs to be bigger and all of these kinds of things. And alhamdulillah, for this one, we didn't have time for all of that. But usually like the flyer alone takes me like a week and a half because I'm constantly, tweaking things. And, at a certain point, just let it be Hidayah, it's fine. As long as people can read it.
Oh, the flyer looks amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. But yeah, as long as people can read it, like leave it alone, right? But we tend to do that with our Islam, right? Another common example that unfortunately I've heard a lot about, like, oh, I don't pray, right? I don't do salat at all, right? And for someone who doesn't pray at all, maybe it's not wise to compare yourself to the people who are doing like 51 rak'ats every single day, right? Maybe your jihad is to start with Fajr and nothing else for now, right? And start there and build on that. Because if you start with the fact that like the Imam says, our Shia do 51 rak'at a day, like you're not going to do anything because you haven't even perfected two, right? So yeah, just the idea of like wherever you are, start small, start with the increments of that. And then inshallah, is like we were talking about before, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will supplement whatever it is you don't have. And like, believe me, He will. You just have to take the tiny steps, and inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will turn them into, something much, much, much bigger. But any closing thoughts, Sheikh and Sayyid, or anybody else really, if you want to chime in here?
Awesome. Any of our participants want to share some thoughts or some ideas?
Oh, Musa, I love the puzzle idea. He says, you didn't, like the puzzle is not defective just because it came unassembled, right? It came how it was supposed to be, and now you have to be the one to put it together. I absolutely love that. That's amazing. I think that's a very like poignant way of describing just life in general, right? You're dealt these cards with these people around you, and as Sayed said, some of those people are your parents, and sometimes our parents are not equipped, right? To even be parents in some situations. And so you have to know that that's the starting point, and then how do I move from here and build on that, you know, for something better. So yeah, I love that idea. So Sheikh Reza, thoughts? Closing
No
thoughts?
thoughts, just being a parent, I realized how I don't think anybody is ready to be a parent. So
Yeah, that's
one
true.
example where
That's true. No, I just meant in terms of like, you know, certain challenges that people have. You know, I'm just thinking of, for example, like someone who might be an addict or something like that, right? And you're born into that, and so now you have to navigate, you know, whatever that looks like. But no, I don't think anybody is, you know, it's not like today I'm ready, and so Allah, like, you know, give me the kids now. But yeah, I think that, you know, we just put a step forward each day, I think.
no, I was just I was partially joking. Knowing some good parents, I do appreciate some people who have the skills. But we just to set it up for Sayed to give his final remarks. I do think, you know, despite having, and we do have this benefit of being Shia, uh, having being parts of School of the Ahlul Bayt, we have both sides of the coin. We both have the ultimate goals and the ultimate, the perfect models that God has placed for us. I mean, the very fact that we have Imam Mahdi, right? One difference between all of the other religions and School of the Ahlul Bayt is that even though all the other religions have a Messiah that they're calling for and they're praying to God for, particularly in this school, we pray to God not just in a general way, but we pray in a very particular way for this person to come. And so that directs our prayers, and it focuses our goals for God to bring back that individual, for us to be able to emulate that individual, to prepare ourselves. And it makes it very real. And I think having role models also makes those virtues that we're aiming for very real, right? It allows us to set those specific goals, and then we can work on those goals and reach them. And then, so we have that side of it, that ideal side. And then we also have the other side, which is engaging in our communities, right? Engaging with our elders, with the scholars, Sayyid, who isn't part of the community. And I think having sort of that flesh and blood example makes that process much easier for us to get ever closer to that ideal that we have set and that has been set for us. And so I think if we are able to combine those two, both be able to understand and learn about the lives of our imams and all of the different dimensions of their personalities, but then also engage with people that, you know, are one step closer to that ideal. And inshallah, as you mentioned, with God's tawfiq and with tawakkul, then we can undo some of those worries and those concerns about perfectionism, and inshallah, again, go along that process of inculcating those virtues in ourselves, of creating those virtues in ourselves, and then as well creating those, actualizing those potentials, getting closer to God, inshallah.
Sayyid?
Sure. I just got a chat from one of you, or a message from one of you about the story that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam mentioned of a person who converted to Islam, and their Muslim friend said, come pray Fajr and Nawafil and then Dhuhr and all this burden. And then the person said, look, you keep your religion because I have a life and a family and all these other obligations. And the lesson that Imam wanted to teach his companions is that, look, first of all, people have different obligations in life, and not everybody can do all of those things. And in fact, they're not worse off, because when they're taking care of their family and their other things, they're also doing ibadah. And if that's what they need to do, then that's more important than this picture we have. And the relevant example I see is that when people say, you know what, I'm not going to the center, or I'm not going to mess around with these other Muslims because there's so much politics and there's so much, so much going on.
Yeah.
I'm better off just doing my dua at home. I'm a better Muslim when I'm alone. If I'm a better Muslim when I'm alone and I can't stand my people, then, or I don't consider them to be my people, then maybe the problem is within me. And maybe I'm better off just doing a little bit less prayer, a little bit less stuff that makes me feel holy and special, and becoming a little bit more of a constructive part of society. So the last thing that I want to say is that, Sheikh Rida asked that question, what does it mean to be yourself? And the fact that people are trying so hard to be authentic or be themselves is kind of a paradox, because whatever you're doing, you're yourself. And a lot of times when people try to be authentic, they're actually following a stereotype that comes to them from somewhere. At the very least, everyone's trying to be authentic and trying to discover themselves. And that itself is not then unique. So maybe we should put less focus on trying to be ourselves, which is me focus, and more on the role models. Or another way to look at it is the direction that I'm going, and make sure that I'm on the right path. If I'm on the right path, sometimes I'm a Tesla and sometimes I'm a beat up, Corolla, but I'm going in the same direction. And it's not really that important exactly what the details of my current vehicle are, or what my own personal details are, but it's important what direction I'm going and that I'm making that effort. When we put the focus that way, I think a lot of it becomes easier on our mind and more effective. And so that's why I think this topic is so important, because the focus is on the role models and how we can live up to what we learn from them, rather than, who I am. So I'd like to thank Shaykh Rida for being with us. I know that you came from a Laylatul Qadr program just before. Thank you, Hidayah, for your insights and for hosting. And all of you who joined it and shared your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I know that I could, be talking to these two scholars all night, but I'm sure that, people need rest and suhoor and all of that other kind of stuff. So thank you so much for joining the suhoor chat. Inshallah, you benefited from it as much as I did. Thank you as always to Sayyid Sulaiman for his insights, and thank you to Sheikh Rida, who agreed to do this, even though I put a lot of pressure on him and it was very, very last minute. I'm very, very grateful for you, and inshallah, please do join us again as much as you're able, inshallah. And for everyone else, please inshallah keep us in your du'as. on this night. And also remember that tomorrow, the day tomorrow, is no less than tonight. So do not stop praying for your loved ones, for one another, for our marhumin, for people who are oppressed anywhere and everywhere in the world, and for the dhuhr of our Imam, inshallah. And with that, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum
Thank
assalam.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.